Hi guys, we'll talk about the medicinal chemistry of antiplatelets today. Um, so the objectives as you go through the notes are the following. First, I want you to recognize the different mechanism of actions um, and how the structure can actually relate to such mechanism for some of the cases, not all of them, as you will see in the material. And then for some drugs, the SAR also plays a role, like you will see with the prodrugs, for example, and then relate the structure to the activity and side effects, as also you will see in some cases, and then compare aspirin to the NSAIDs as far as antiplatelets. Why is aspirin used as antiplatelets while the others are not, the other NSAIDs? And then relate the inhibition of antiplatelets, the type of inhibition, whether it's reversible or irreversible, um, to the time it takes to lose the antiplatelet activity after discontinuation of therapy. The other way, if you take two drugs, one of them is reversible and another is irreversible, um, they are both antiplatelets, and then if you discontinue the therapy, which one would last longer into the body? Which one would take long time before it's actually completely eliminated, or before actually the antiplatelet activity disappears? And how this affects our choice of antiplatelets, and how this can impact the cases where you have, for example, an urgent surgery. Okay, all these will be discussed in the notes today. And then compare between clopidogrel, ticlopidine, and prasugrel, the pros and cons for each one of them. Mainly, the clopidogrel has a wide inter-patient variability, meaning it varies from one, the response might vary from one to another depending on the genetics for that patient, unlike these two, but these two are have some safety concerns. And then describe the rationale for designing these kind of receptors. As you will see, the receptors bind to fibrinogen. Fibrinogen has 3 amino acids that are particularly responsible for binding to the receptor, and then the design was to mimic these amino acids, either to use them, these 3 amino acids, or use ones that are similar, or even design a drug that mimics these amino acids. And then finally, just appreciates the need for new antiplatelet agents with the current problems we have with the antiplatelets. Okay, let's start by a quick overview of the classes used as of drugs used for antiplatelets. The first one is the COX-1 inhibitors, such as aspirin, and then the phosphodiesterase enzyme inhibitors, such as the dipyridamole and the xylostazole. Don't worry about the brand name, at least for my portion. I think you probably have to memorize these for the therapeutics portion though. Then the third one is platelets, P2Y pyrogenic receptor. P2Y is a receptor, and it has two kinds of inhibitors. Ones are irreversible, another are reversible. The reversible one are actually new products that came out to the market recently. And then you have the glycoprotein 2B and 3A receptor antagonists. We have 3 examples of them. Then finally the PAR1 antagonists. We have an example. Okay. Before we start talking about the classes of antiplatelets, let me visit the pathophysiology of the thrombosis process. This is just a quick overview to connect the mechanism of action for these classes of antiplatelet drugs. This is not meant to be tested on, so I'm not expecting you to actually know all these biochemical pathways. You probably have to know this for the pathophysiology and for Dr. Jones' material, but not for my class. So I wanted just to briefly go over these mechanisms. So when I refer to them, you know what I'm talking about. So first, there are two cases. In the case of the normal endothelial cells, so before any injury occurs, we have the um, vascular wall here, endothelial cell. They synthesize and release the prostaglandin I2, also known as prostacyclin, which stimulates the conversion of ATP into cyclic AMP. And this cyclic AMP is the one that prevents the platelets aggregation and a process known as degranulation. So degranulation basically is you have granules or vessels inside these platelets, and inside these vessels or granules there are some chemicals that further stimulate the release further stimulates the platelet aggregation process. Examples of these chemicals are listed here as other secondary messengers such as thrombin, ADP, um, serotonin, also known as 5-hydroxytryptophan. Anyway, so the job of the cyclic AMP is to prevent the platelet aggregation, the platelets sticking together, and also prevents the release of these materials. Basically, stop the degranulation process. Okay. So our goal, as you will see later on, is to enhance or increase the amount of the cyclic AMP such that we inhibit the platelets aggregation. So our goal is to maintain this normal process. Okay, and that's why you see here the dipyridamole, for example, it inhibits the metabolism or the degradation of the cyclic AMP. So this is one of the antiplatelet drugs. By inhibiting the metabolism of cyclic AMP, then we have more of the cyclic AMP, which will give you more natural conditions, basically preventing the platelet aggregation and the degranulation. Okay, now let's switch to the case of injury. Okay, in the case of the injury of the cell or basically the endothelial cell, two chemicals, one of them is the von Willebrand factor and another one is the collagen. They bind to a receptor called GP, glycoprotein IB, and glycoprotein IA. So this is the first step, and due to this binding, this site here is activated, which is responsible for causing the platelets to stick together through the fibrinogen. This arrow here, or this thing here with two arrows, represents the fibrinogen, which actually sticks platelets together. So, for example, this platelets and this platelet here, they will stick together through this side, and then there's another site here for the next platelet to stick with the next one using the fibrinogen. Okay, so the first step, like we said, is for these two substances to bind to this receptor, followed by the fibrinogen binding to the GP2B/3A receptors, also known as fibrinogen receptor, because they bind to the fibrinogen. They're also called integrin receptors because integrin is also one of the chemicals that can cause the binding of platelets. Okay, so these receptors are responsible for the cross-linking of platelets through the fibrinogen. And as you will see here, and later on, some chemicals, they bind to this site, they block it, so they prevent the fibrinogen from binding and prevent the aggregation. As we will see later, examples are the apixaban and the epiphebatine and the tirofiban. Anyway, so this is the second step, and then the third one is as a result of the binding of two platelets together, it further activates some signal transduction process leading to release of secondary chemicals. These secondary messengers are, for example, the thrombin, which is responsible for production of the ADP, and ADP actually will play an important role, as we will see here. The ADP can bind to these sites such that it actually first induce the aggregation and also maintain the aggregation of the platelets. Okay, and there's also other um, chemicals such as the prostaglandin, PGI2, and thromboxane A2. In fact, PGI2 it's released as well in this injury process. Although here we notice that PGI2 was released in the normal process to protect and to prevent the aggregation. And indeed here prostaglandin prevents the aggregation. So we have two opposite effects for these two chemicals. One of them is to prevent the aggregation. The other one, the thromboxane, will actually induce the thrombogenesis, the aggregation, and will also cause vasoconstriction. We have another chemical also called serotonin, or the 5-hydroxytryptophan, which is released from the platelets and have similar effects to the thromboxane. So I guess the PGI2 try to make a balance between, in the case of the injury, try to make a balance between, um, thrombosis or anti-thrombosis. Let me highlight a few of the mechanisms of some drugs. Like we said, this one here prevents the fibrinogene from binding, prevents the platelets from sticking together. This class of drugs is called the GPIB/3A antagonists. Okay, and we have also, like we said, the dipyrimidol, which prevents the degradation of the cyclic AMP, and then it increases the cyclic AMP, which helps in maintaining the normal conditions. It prevents the aggregation of the platelets. It prevents also the degranulation, like we said. We have the aspirin, which prevents the synthesis of the prostaglandin H2 and the thromboxane A2. So this would also prevent the platelets from getting together and forming thrombus. There is another class which works on P2Y12, and in this case it blocks the ADP, and we said ADP plays an important role in first initiating the platelet aggregation and sustaining the platelet aggregation. So in this case the P2Y1 is the one that's responsible for the initiation of the aggregation, and then P2Y12 is the one that sustains these aggregation. So by designing antagonists that bind to this site and prevent the ADP from binding, then this can cause, stop the aggregation and the forming the thrombus formation. Okay. The first class of the antiplatelets is actually the COX-1 inhibitors, and the only example we have in this class, actually the only example you have in the States for this class is the aspirin. There are two other examples that are not in the United States, so we're not gonna talk about them. So aspirin has actually a well-established antiplatelet activity, and it actually binds irreversibly to the COX-1, causing the antithrombotic effects. It acetylates amino acids called the serine, which is part of the cyclooxygenase enzyme, and form an irreversible binding. Now, if you remember, when we talked about the irreversible binding in the case of the monoamine oxidase enzymes and with the antacids in previous sessions, we said that when you have a drug that binds irreversibly to an enzyme, then it sticks with that enzyme forever until the enzyme is replaced by something else. Until the enzymes disappear and new enzymes are synthesized. In this case, the aspirin does the same thing, and all these classes that we will talk about that causes irreversible binding to the enzyme, they actually stick with these enzymes for as long as the lifetime of the platelets, which is from 7 to 10 days. Okay. In fact, this is believed one of the reasons why the other NSAIDs do not have antiplatelet activity. So the other NSAIDs such as ibuprofen, naproxen, and indomethacin, um, all these NSAIDs, they actually bind reversibly to the COX enzymes, unlike the aspirin, which binds irreversibly. It acetylates the enzyme and sticks with it forever. Another effect that is unique about the aspirin and is unrelated to its inhibition to COX-1 is basically the inhibition of the platelet function and the enhancement of fibrinolysis and the suppression of blood coagulation. These factors or these functions contribute to the antithrombotic effect, the antiplatelet effect for aspirin, which makes it unique. There is a term called aspirin resistance, which represents the fact that some patients are not responsive to the aspirin, and it's believed that one explanation, possible explanation, is due to the fact that some temporary enzymes like COX-2 are being synthesized in these newly formed platelets, and therefore the platelets are able to avoid basically this enzyme works instead of the COX-1 and is able to do the conversion of the arachidonic acid to the prostaglandins. In these cases, we call this case aspirin resistance. Okay. The next class of antiplatelet agents is the phosphodiesterase 3 inhibitors, and this enzyme, as we mentioned earlier in the graph we started with, is responsible for the degradation of the cyclic AMP. So there is the cyclic AMP, and then using this enzyme, the cyclic AMP is degraded. Notice that one of the phosphorus group here is removed, and so by inhibition of this enzyme, we'll have more of the cyclic AMP. And if you remember a minute ago, we mentioned that cyclic AMP is the one responsible for inhibiting the aggregation and basically maintaining the normal cell, prevent the aggregation of platelets. Okay, it's also responsible for the vasodilation. Okay, we have two examples on this class of medication. One of them is the dipyridamole, also known as Agrinox. It comes in capsules. Actually, this is an orally given drug. There's also the xylostazole, Plital, which is another drug. Both of them are phosphodiesterase inhibitors. These actually inhibits, prevents the platelets aggregation in through two pathways. One of them is directly, like we explained, by inhibiting the phosphodiesterase enzyme 3, and then indirectly by blocking the uptake of adenosine. So here is the adenosine here, and then these two compounds block the reuptake of adenosine. When this adenosine is blocked, then it's actually more available to act on a receptor, a G protein coupled receptor, but we won't worry about that now. So it binds to a receptor called A2 receptor. When this adenosine binds to that receptor, it actually stimulates this enzyme, adenyl cyclase, which is responsible for the synthesis of the cyclic AMP from ATP. So you have a stimulation for the synthesis of the cyclic AMP indirectly, and therefore we have more of the cyclic AMP, and we have a direct inhibition for the prostaglandin E3, and therefore we have more of the cyclic AMP. So both would lead to increase in the cyclic AMP, which, like we said, prevents the platelets aggregation and prevents the degranulation, the breakthrough of the granules and releasing of the secondary messenger chemicals. We should also mention that the xylostazole is actually more potent. It's more selective, not more potent, it's more selective to the dipyridamole. I'm not sure if it's more potent or not, so I will check the dosages to see if it's more potent. But it is more selective than the dipyridamole, which means it inhibits prostaglandin E3, okay, more than it would affect prostaglandin. I'm sorry, I said prostaglandin. It inhibits the phosphodiesterase E3 more than it would affect phosphodiesterase 1 and 4. Try to find what the inhibition of phosphodiesterase 1, 2, and 4 would lead to. In fact, I don't think you have studied this yet or not, but check the mechanism of action for the Viagra, which actually inhibits one of these phosphodiesterase and causes vasodilation. In fact, as we'll see later on with the vasodilators, that Viagra was initially designed to be a vasodilator to reduce the blood pressure. Anyway, so just look at the different receptors and see which one is the one responsible for the action of the Viagra compared to this one here. So again, this is an example of the importance of the selectivity. Finally, the xylostazol should be taken with high-fat meal to increase its bioavailability. So its bioavailability increases to about 9% when this drug is taken with high-fat meal. Okay. As we mentioned earlier, in the physiologic pathways of the thrombus formation, the ADP plays a crucial role in platelet activation and aggregation through targeting two receptors, P2Y1 and P2Y12, purogenic receptors in the platelets. Okay. So first, through the initial binding of ADP to this receptor P2Y1, a change to the shape of the platelet occurs, followed by mobilizing the calcium intracellularly inside the platelets, followed by initiation of the aggregation. Like we said, P2Y1 initiates the aggregation, and then we have the binding of the ADP to P2Y12, which leads to the subsequent aggregation or sustained of the aggregation of the platelets. In fact, the binding of ADP to P2Y12 inhibits the adenylate cyclase enzyme, and this enzyme is responsible for synthesizing the cyclic AMP. So if we inhibit this enzyme, then we're going to have less of the cyclic AMP, which was important for preventing the platelets aggregation. So now we'll have continuous aggregation of the platelets. So we have initiation and we have sustaining the platelet aggregation. Okay, now there are two kinds of drugs that inhibit or that actually binds or compete with the ADP to its binding site. So the ADP is important for the aggregation of the platelets. It binds to these two receptors. So if we could block these receptors or prevent the ADP from binding, then we should expect to have antiplatelet effects. So in these examples, we are actually targeting the P2Y12 in both examples. So we have two examples, or two actually categories. One of them is the irreversible inhibitors. Those are the ones that bind to the receptor P2Y12 irreversibly. Okay. The examples about these are the ticlovidine, or brand name is Ticlet, clopidogrel, the famous clopidogrel, and the brand name is Plavix, and the prasugrel, the brand name is Effient. The first thing we need to know about this class of inhibitors, and in general about all irreversible inhibitors, is the fact that they remain after the discontinuation of the therapy for at least 7 to 10 days, which is the lifetime of the platelets. So, which could be actually a concern. We'll explain why that is the case. So these irreversible inhibitors, just like we saw with the aspirin, they bind to this enzyme through covalent bond, like here, as we'll explain shortly, and it blocks the it causes antiplatelet activity, which lasts 7 to 10 days, which is the lifetime of the platelets, even after the discontinuation of this therapy. Okay, um, which is a major feature for the irreversible inhibitors, unlike the reversible inhibitors, which we'll discuss shortly. In the case of the ticlopidine, it actually has a major safety concern because about 1 to 2% of the people who take this medication develop neutropenia, which is reduction in the white blood cells, and this is actually potentially fatal, and it can cause thrombotic, thrombocytopenic purpura, or also known as TTP. I'm not much concerned about the mechanism of how this occur, but let's focus on the fact that ticlopidine has a major safety concern, and that's why it's been largely replaced by clopidogrel because these side effects are rare in the case of clopidogrel. Okay, now all these three actually are prodrugs, which means they are inactive and they have to be activated. They are activated through the cytochrome P450. Okay. In the case of the clopidogrel, the most significant metabolites are, let's look here at the graph. So this is clopidogrel. Well, first of all, clopidogrel, the majority of clopidogrel is metabolized into this inactive form, which actually makes the bioavailability for the clopidogrel very low. I think it has about 15% of oral bioavailability, which is a disadvantage, one of the disadvantages for clopidogrel. Okay, so there's a major metabolite for clopidogrel, which is the carboxy metabolite, which is inactive. But then there is minor metabolism through the CYP3A4 and other isoforms, which is CYP2, C19, 1A2, and 2B6, to produce this metabolite, which is the oxoclopidogrel. So basically, the addition of a ketone group here, forming the oxoclopidogrel, which is then converted into the hydrolyzed into the thiometabolites. Okay, this one here is the active form. The thiometabolite is the active form. So clopidogrel is inactive and then is converted into the active form, which binds to the receptor P2Y12, to a cysteine. Actually, there is a cysteine amino acids. As you know, receptors are proteins, so one of the amino acids at the binding site of that protein is the cysteine. So it formed this covalent bond, and therefore you have an irreversible inhibition for that enzyme. Okay, for that, receptor. Okay, and then, okay, let's see. So I've talked about this and that. Okay, I should mention that there is one major concern about the use of clopidogrel or Plavix, which is the fact that it has a wide interpatient variability, which means that this process, which is important for the activation of clopidogrel, can vary from one person to another because of genetic differences. So having different polymorph of the cytochrome P450, mainly this one here, the CYP2C19. So the clopidogrel has wide interpatient variability due to genetic polymorphism, mostly in this enzyme. So because of this metabolic enzyme, because of changes in this metabolic enzyme, Dr. Jones will elaborate on this and talk about the alleles and how these can be tested. Anyway, so because of that, clopidogrel has a major concern. In fact, there is a black box warning that was released, I think, 2010, about the use of Plavix or clopidogrel as an antiplatelet. So, as you can imagine, if you administer this drug to someone who has, for example, less of this enzyme, so this drug is not going to be activated. You're going to have more of the inactive form, so you can have less effect of the antiplatelets activity, and then while you might think that the patient is protected, it turns out that they are not, and they might have some complications like formation of the thrombus or something like that. So this is a major concern with the clopidogrel, and I wanted to say that there is some tests, actually experiments that are available, some kits that or some labs that perform the genetic tests to find if clopidogrel could be effective for some patients or not. I think one major issue with it is that some insurance companies do not pay for these, others do, so it depends on what insurance plans do you have. But this is again outside of my area of expertise, just I thought it might be worth it to mention it. I know that some doctors recommend these tests before they actually prescribe clopidogrel. Some doctors might not even realize that there is such a concern, so you as a pharmacist can actually point that out to them and recommend them to do the genetic tests. Anyway, so back to here. So in the case of ticlopidine, the oxidation occurs to produce these metabolites. So again, all these are inactive. So in the ticlopidine, we have oxidation causing again the oxo in this form, and which is converted into this active form, which is very similar to this. Now, at the star here shows the site, the binding site with the receptor. So the same here, it binds with the P2 Y12, even though I did not draw the picture, but the same concept applies here, and it irreversibly binds to this receptor. And the same happened with the prasugrel. It binds to this receptor. I want to say that one of the metabolites for the ticlopidine is something called, for short, M2 and M6, which are positively charged pyridine ring here, that are believed to be the ones responsible for the toxicity and the toxicity. Right, so it's believed that the M5 and M6 are responsible for the toxicity associated with ticlopidine, which, like we mentioned earlier, a major reason for a safety concern with the ticlopidine, and a reason why it's been largely replaced by Plavix or clopidogrel. The only thing with Plavix is, like we said, the wide interpatient variability. Okay, so we have a third product here also, which is prasugrel, where its activation requires hydrolysis first, followed by oxidation, and then it produces this active metabolites. Yes, so hydrolysis here occurs first because this is an ester, and then oxidation results into the 2-oxo form, which then gives this form, the active form, and just like the other two, it binds with the cysteine amino acid residues at the binding site of this receptor, and form covalent bond, irreversible bonding, and that is like the other molecules. And then there's one step further here that shows that this product is later on metabolized by S-methylation, hence the addition of the S. So I guess the ones that are left over, they did not interact with the receptor. The ones that are left, they are metabolized and excreted, and they are in the inactive form. Okay, so, and of course, unlike the clopidogrel, the prasugrel has reduced interpatient variability than the clopidogrel, and could be an alternative for the clopidogrel. The only thing is the prasugrel has higher rate of major bleeding and life-threatening bleeding than the clopidogrel. So there is some pros and cons for the use of each one of these products. Okay. Finally, taking the prasugrel with high-fat meals would slow down the time it takes for the drug to reach the maximum concentration, and therefore it is recommended to be taken on an empty stomach. So there are two examples here in this notes that talks about the use of taking this drug with high-fat diets. Um, the previous example was for the silostazole, in which um, this drug, if taken with high-fat meals, it would improve the bioavailability, while in the case of the prasugrel, the opposite occurs. So if you take it with high-fat diets, then the there will be a slow in uh, the time it takes to reach the maximum plasma concentration, so it's recommended to be taken with empty stomach. Okay. The next category or class of these uh, P2Y12 inhibitors are the reversible ones. And here's the major difference between the two. In the case of the irreversible, after the discontinuation of the medication, we'll have to wait 7 to 10 days before the before new platelets are synthesized, and then the basically platelets go back to normal. And this might cause a problem because if at any time when the patient is taking this medication, if an urgent surgery is required, then there would be a risk of bleeding, because these products cause antiplatelets, they cause anticoagulation. So if a surgery is required at any time, then um, these products cannot be stopped immediately. So you will have to stop these medications at least 5 days. And I would expect, and you might expect I should wait 7 to 10 days, but I guess they say at least 5 days, so maybe at least 50% of these drugs or these platelets are restored, such that when you do a surgery, then there is enough platelets to stop the bleeding. Okay, so that was one of the reasons for the need of the reversible inhibitors. Another reason is the fact that the prasugrel, although it does not have interpatient variability like the clopidogrel, it has higher rate of life-threatening bleeding. And in the case of the clopidogrel, of course, there's the problem of the interpatient variability. So again, one more reason why we need to synthesize or think about designing new drugs. So the reversible inhibitors, there are two examples of these. One on the reversible inhibitors for the P2Y12 receptor. One of them is called the ticagrelor. The brand name is called Brilinta. And the other one is the cangrelor. The brand name is called Cangrel. And they both, like we said, cause reversible inhibition to the P2Y12. The ticagrelor is taken orally. It's the first one that was designed to be reversible. And the cangrelor is actually taken through intravenous infusion or administration. So the ticagrelor not only has a fast onset and offset action, it also produces more predictable effect than clopidogrel. And of course, clopidogrel, because of the interpatient variability, it's hard to predict its effects on patients. But here, the ticagrelor does not have this problem, and so it's more predictable. Its effect is more predictable, and it has, of course, fast onset and offset. It's reversible, so the minute we stop this medication, it's within short amount of time, I can't remember, within minutes or hours, this medication will be actually out of the system, which is much better than waiting for 5 days or 7 to 10 days. And with the cangrelor, it's taken actually intravenous, and therefore this is advantageous because, say, somebody is needing a surgery, then if you want to prevent the clotting or the forming of platelet aggregation during the surgery, then you could administer this drug, and then only during the time of the surgery as needed, and then when you're finished with the surgery, you stop the drug, and then everything go back to normal, which is very helpful. Okay, the next class of antiplatelets medications are those that bind to the site where fibrinogen makes a cross-link between platelets. If you remember in the first graph, there was a site where fibrinogen binds to, and it makes a bridge between two platelets together, helping them forming the aggregation. This site, this receptor is called the glycoprotein 2B3A receptor. And by designing antagonists that fill this receptor, then we prevent the fibrinogen from binding to this receptor. So again, it's a novel class of compounds that provides actually a more comprehensive inhibition than the other classes, also compared to the aspirin and heparin, although we have not studied heparin yet. Okay, so the final, and if you remember, the final common pathway for the platelet aggregation is the activation of these receptors, and then a fibrinogen would bind to the receptor on this receptor on both platelets that are being cross-linked, and then a bridge or a cross-link between them is formed, and at the surface of these platelets, and that's how the aggregation occurs. So again, if these surface receptors are occupied by a substance to prevent the fibrinogen, then the antiplatelets occur. Now I need to mention, then the aggregation will not occur, will stop. Okay, so then you should think about you should consider that those drugs that would fill this receptor should have some similarity to the fibrinogen. Indeed, the part of the fibrinogen that binds to this receptor has an amino acid sequence called arginine, glycine, aspartate, and for short, each amino acid is given one letter. So the arginine is R, glycine is G, aspartate is D. In fact, all the 20 amino acids, 20 or 22, I can't remember now. Anyway, so each one of the amino acids have a letter that represents them. So for short, we'll say the RGD amino acid sequence. So now, if you want to design a drug to fill this receptor, then you imagine that this drug would mimic this sequence of amino acids, and indeed, there are different ways of preventing or blocking these receptors. One of them is first to design an antibody that would attack the receptor, as we will see. Another one is to use natural peptides, like the one extracted from the snake venom. It's called disintegrin, which has the sequence arginine, glycine, aspartate, the RGD sequence. Okay, and then it would block that receptor. And then, of course, another example is to use a synthetic peptides that would contain either this sequence of amino acid or something similar. Like, as you will see, we have the lysine, glycine, and aspartate, which is similar to that sequence. And this way it would fill the receptor. And of course, you could also design a drug, or maybe that you could design a drug that is similar to a protein, or that is not protein, that would have similarity to this sequence. So you could maybe design one that does not have exact amino acids, but might have function groups similar to them. So just several ways, all of them relies on the fact of the similarity on designing drugs that are similar to this sequence of amino acids that present in the fibrinogen. I believe in the case of the antibodies, it just attacks that receptor site. I'm not sure if it actually has similarity to these or not. Okay, so, and with this class of drugs, like all the other ones, there's also concern of bleeding. Okay, and there's also a suggestion that these drugs could also increase the risk of thrombocytopenia. These are examples of these drugs, although we'll only talk about 2 of them. The other ones are not fully marketed yet. So this one here shows the structure for the eptifepatide, which is one of the products that have this 3 amino acids: lysine, glycine, aspartate, which is responsible for binding to the receptor because it's similar to the 3 amino acid sequence in the original fibrinogen. So this part here is the active site, the active part responsible for making the interaction with the receptor. Okay, and the others have some similar features. Have similarities in structure to this part, such that they can compete with the fibrinogen and bind to the receptor. Okay, so examples on this class of drugs. The first one is the apixaban. The brand name for it is the Riopro, and it's, like we said, it's an antibody that directly binds to the receptor and inhibits its function. Okay. The only thing about this that it's very expensive. It costs about $1,500 for a single dose, which actually reduces its use. And then we have the example we talked about a minute ago, the eptifibatide. The brand name is called integralin, and it's a cyclic heptapeptide, as we mentioned, composed of 6 amino acids. Now 3 of these amino acids are the one that mimics the RGD. Okay, and then these 6 amino acids actually form a cycle, and the cycle is linked, or the amino acids are linked through a disulfide bridge between the cysteine and mercapto propionyl moiety. And then the lysine aspartates, like we said, these 3 amino acids mimics the other RGD amino acids, and then that's how it binds to the receptor. It does have a low binding affinity, therefore it dissociates fast, so it's reversible, which is nice, so you don't have to worry about the waiting for a long time after you stop the medication. It's actually given parenterally, okay, not orally. And then the next example is the tirofiban, and it's a class of antithrombotic agent called fibans. They have structural similarity to the fibrinogen or disintegrin, same thing. They also have the similarity to the RGD in the original fibrinogen. In fact, the distance between the 2 terminals amino acids is the same as those in the original integrin, about 15 to 16 atoms, or about 15 to 17 angstrom in length. Anyway, you got the idea, hopefully. And then it has a rapid dissociation constant, so it's again reversibly bind. What else? It's a non-peptide, and it also has a reduced risk of bleeding because it's shorter half-life compared to the apixaban. And then finally, it is less costly, like we said, compared to that, the apixaban. There are other agents, the lamivudine, which is also given parenterally, and then recently we have 2 products. I believe they are still under development. All these are still under development. They have not been marketed yet. Obviously, they don't have a brand name. So these 2 products should be coming orally if they pass the clinical phases. And then finally, although the orally antagonists have been prepared, their clinical efficacy has not been fully established. So all these are still under studies. Okay, and of course these are also given parenterally, but also but they're still trying to design more drugs to be given orally. Okay, so the last class, as you can tell, there are still some issues with the current products available, either due to the interpatient variability, like the case of the clopidogrel or the Plavix, and or due to some bleeding adverse effects with the other drugs. So there's still a need for designing more drugs. Recently, there's antagonists called PAR1 antagonists, or 2 products. One of them is called the Varapaxar, and it's been marketed, and it's in the market called Zantivity. It's orally available. It has high oral availability. It competes with the PAR1 receptor, and it actually, MedC, inhibit the thrombin-mediated platelets formation. And the other one is the atopaxar, which is still under development. It's in phase 2 so far, if I'm correct. So this shows the most recent class that people are working on right now.